Hello, everyone. My name is Carolina, and I'm here representing Arkbound Foundation, which is a charity working to widen the access to literature and improve diversity within publishing. Today, we have here with us Jane Riddiford, who has written a chapter for an upcoming Arkbound book coming up this October. The name of the book being Climate Adaptation. Jane Riddiford founded Global Generation in 2004, and she has more than 25 years of experience with environmental arts and vocational training projects, both in New Zealand and in the UK. And some of the examples of the projects that Jane has been involved in are managing a city farm for a framework trust, developing an inner city forest in Auckland as a learning resource, setting up horticulture programs, and coordinating Camden's environmental education network. She also managed Rise Phoenix, a community arts organization that worked with children and young people in war-torn areas of the Balkans, also in Tanzania and in London. Welcome, Jane. It's lovely to have you here.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to kickstart this interview by asking you a little bit about your personal journey that led you to your current work with the Global Generation and ultimately to writing a chapter for this book.
Sure, no problem. Well, back in the early 2000s, I was running a community arts organization that we worked in the Balkans after the civil wars, and we also worked in Camden, and we had an opportunity to take inner city children, many of them who'd never left London before, camping on a big organic farm. And we were staying in an old, actually a pretty ancient hawthorn forest. And it was the experience I had of seeing those kids connect to the ground under their feet, the stars above their heads, and ultimately to themselves and each other. And it created a completely different atmosphere between them. From at first, kind of staying up all night and being terrified, and then they really settled into the land. And I thought, gosh, there's something here that's giving us clues to finding our way into the future. You could say a more land-based sensibility, and that feeling that they were connected to more than just the human world. And it was that sowed a seed in me, I guess. And I went back to London, and the idea began to grow. What would happen if we really developed a campsite there in that forest, and took children there, and some volunteers got involved with me, and we did that. But then we thought, what about our cities? How do we bring that experience of the forest to the middle of the city? And our first project was on top of an office building, and it was a really fertile project, even though it went through kind of bumpy twists and turns. We developed a living roof, and it was a biodiverse living roof. We got logs and wood chip and so forth from the nearby Hampstead Heath in London, and developed a wildlife garden up there. There was a terrible drought that happened, and everything died, but that really inspired us to think about water. And we actually put in a grey to green water system where we captured water from the toilets. And not only that, we did rainwater harvesting, and we suddenly found out that we had way more water than we knew what to do with. And we involved local children and young people in growing vegetables, and that gave a reason for different relationships to happen between local young people and the people who worked in the building. And not only did they work together, but suddenly you had young people teaching the business people who were coming in and out by day about the health of the soil and about how plants grow. And it was a lovely kind of reverse mentoring, if you like. And that was the beginning of thinking, there's something about creating these gardens in unlikely spaces that are somewhat out of bounds in a city. You could say they're like the edgelands of a city, and places that are, I guess, the and place between what can so often happen of the us and them, particularly as parts of, big cities like London get gentrified, and that some of those social divisions can get even wider. Or you'll get this kind of weird, people call it corporate, what is it called? Social responsibility for corporates, but so often it comes across as some sort of, well, I call it corporate colonialism, and let's go out and help. And, I sometimes feel in myself, well, we don't, and can we give you some business advice? And I can sometimes feel a bit of a rebellious reaction in me of like, we don't want to be like you. But it's something very good when you can set up a dialogue and you can set up excuses to begin, and it becomes a two-way learning, both between young people and business people, or between not-for-profits and businesses. And there's a learning from each other and a mutual exchange. Then it becomes really powerful. There's an Aboriginal educator who quite a long time ago called Layla Watson. And she said this thing: if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then we must work together. And that has been a real motto for Global Generation in any relationship we've done. Is there possibilities for two-way learning? So it's kind of why we work in the places we work. And then from those rooftop projects, we did get to meet, we had the opportunities of doing projects on the ground in King's Cross. And our first projects that got quite well known were the skip garden. And we had a number of skip gardens that moved around what ended up being quite a sort of another shiny new developed part of London, but we created some pockets of something very different. And then now we have the story garden, which I wrote about in the chapter, and the paper garden, which is on the site of what was a former printing press. Actually, it was the Daily Mail printing paper. It's not anymore, I hasten to add. But so we, that's where the paper garden is, and the story garden is behind the British Library and King's Cross Station.
Okay, nice to hear about all of these lovely projects that you've been involved in with Global Generation. And you also mentioned the chapter, which is called Wayfinding in a Time of COVID. So could you let us know a little bit about this notion of wayfinding and how it's influencing your work?
Yeah, sure. I'm a New Zealander, and one of the influences on me has been Professor Shelley Spiller, who's a Māori scholar and has done a lot of work around Māori enterprise and also particularly wayfinding and leadership. And so the wayfinders, they were the early Pacific explorers who found their way across the Pacific in their double-hulled canoes without maps. And about the time Captain Cook was getting washed up on the rocks with his following maps, as they had probably done for thousands of years, the wayfinders, I mean, they're in other parts of the world. I think the Bedouins across the desert were considered wayfinders, were reading their way through the stars, through the ripples on the sea, through the just slight changes in their body and what was happening in the team. So I would, in my words, I would say bringing in lots and lots of different ways of knowing and being completely present in the moment. And there was certain, as far as I understand, and big qualities, like very much it was about a relational approach with one's team and with the elements, and also not praying for calm seas, but praying for courage to meet whatever came your way. So I got introduced to the concept of wayfinding, and then Shelley actually came in 2016 and worked with our team in London and brought those ideas to us. It was a lovely connection for me. There I had something from my roots in New Zealand coming right to the middle of King's Cross. And in fact, she came with her mother, and they began by doing a karakia, which is a traditional Māori welcome. And I thought, wow, I never thought I'd see the day where that was happening amidst all the glass and shiny buildings. But it had a big impact on our team. And it's one of the principles or ways of working that has kind of stuck with us. So when COVID struck, without particularly saying too much, I think there was a groundwork that people, our team, were able to stand in the uncertainty of it all and stand in an unknown future. And if you like, adapt and change and set our sail according to the way the winds have blown. So when I was asked to write the chapter, and very much thinking about what are the glimpses we might have now for how we might live in a climate change world, I thought of the events of, at that point, the last 12 months that had been of COVID. And I had just pulled together a blog, like a review blog for the year, which had drawn off lots of people's words. It was kind of looking back over the last 12 months, and I thought, oh, this would be a good foundation to think about how the spirit of wayfinding had helped us find our way through. And in fact, I just wrote to someone this morning, I think actually we're a much stronger organization than we were 2 years ago. And our work is really flourishing, and leadership and strength has come from different quarters all through the organization. So it's really encouraged people to just be very sensitive and creative about what's happening. And then in the chapter, I do write about the specific examples of the things we did, like, growing food for local food banks, working with people online, working with young people in small groups, but particularly working with nature as a source of guidance and strength, if you like. So giving people, really inviting them and giving them opportunities to connect to the nature spots in our local community, or just at their back door and seeing what's coming through the cracks in the concrete.
Yes, so you were tapping a little bit into my next question, which would be about, so you do a lot of work with the communities where you set up the gardens, even if they're temporary. So how do you say that all of this work has positively affected the communities and gotten them involved in climate adaptation work?
Well, I think actually it has, the biggest thing is it's given them faith and confidence to try stuff themselves. So I would say that our gardens are, in some ways they're more educational gardens than a straight out community garden. There is a kind of ethos and a direction that's held. We're a charity. It's not a full-on kind of local community membership organization, but it's the, I'd like to think they're small beacons of light or showing what's possible. And then we're doing a lot of involved in outreach work with the wider community. So I know we help operate like a greening fund for local people to apply for funds. Local people, they do have allotment beds in our gardens. Young people are involved in our programs, and we're now employing some of them. Some of them are now working in quite an influential way in the wider community. And it's something we've really kind of thought about, and we can act as a conduit to bring in resources. But not only that, I think it's just showing precedence that things can be done. So one of the initiatives actually I write about in the chapter, we managed to develop, some of our skips became some of the first parklets on a road, on the side of a road in Camden. And now that's kind of pushed the local authority to change their processes and practices. It's taken a long time. Finally, I think it's taken about 2 years nearly for them to actually develop their procedures so it can actually happen. But so I would like to say we open up little glimpses of what might be, and then we offer some practical resources along with funding. And, you know, we have some of our gardeners specifically work out supporting in the wider community. We're also now doing horticulture training as well, but very much trying to hold that balance between, okay, some spots we're totally in control of, but others it's much more of an enabling and empowering role.
Lovely. So also, stories seem to be a big part of the work that you do. You have a story garden, you do story walks, and also you can see there are stories involved in several of the projects that you develop. So what should you think is the real power of stories in changing our relationship to nature, especially in cities, maybe?
Yeah, wow, that's a good question, and I love that question. Well, I think Martin Shaw, who's a mythologist, he sums it up really beautifully. He says that earthy metaphors need to be wrapped around us like a cloak, or the literal will feed us many untruths. So I think there's that. I think we have to change our metaphorical landscape. And, you know, it's a kind of, you could get quite philosophical about this, but I think it is important to, as much as we've got to imagine where are we heading to. You know, there's something about thinking for the long time and thinking, how do we live in a climate changed world? I think we also have to look backwards and think, where do we come from? And, you know, personally, I don't think there's enough contemplation that goes on about how did we wind up in the kind of worldview that sees the earth as a commodity and there for the taking, and arguably that created this climate change mess that we're in. So there's something about, you know, for me, I think there is something about, you know, what happened after the Black Plague, and that, you know, just sort of, and after, around the time of the Renaissance afterwards, where we felt we needed to control nature because people were dying, and the great fear of nature and the need to, and also, so there's that, and there's also the kind of potentials that came out from separating ourselves out and looking and treating it as an object, you know, because arguably lots and lots of things happened and there were lots of amazing breakthroughs in the Industrial Revolution. But now we've got to do catch up, and we have to stitch ourselves back into the story. And we lost that story sensibility, and we lost that sense of mythos and faith, and, you know, everything was observable and empirical, and for very understandable reasons. But I just think we have to re-find ourselves within the story, and we have to develop a storied sensibility. And then it has all many connections, because I think story is the language of connection. Story is the language of the earth. Story is that which will reconnect us so we can find our place within a woven universe, if you like. So yeah, and I just think, and it also, it helps you make the leap between what seems impossible to the impossible, and shows pathways that, other ways of trying to make meaning and rational logic and all of that. It has its place and metrics, but it's just simply not big enough for the whole of our experience, and it's certainly not big enough for the language of our imaginations. So that's it.
Yes, definitely. I think stories allow us to access other types of things that we normally don't have access to.
Yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah.
one of my favorite parts of the chapter was the Voices of the Earth project, which again also merges stories from mythic and scientific stories of plants. Do you think that these kinds of meeting places for different types of knowledge, such as scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge, will be what allows us to accelerate change, perhaps?
I certainly think it's really fertile space and relatively unexplored. I think it's really, really powerful. And I think it also gives us all a doorway to find our indigeneity. I mean, obviously, for those of us with a heritage like myself, there's something about naming and facing the fault lines of the past and recognizing the shadows of that, especially if one has a heritage of being the dominant narrative. I think we have to make room for that and try and grapple with the shadows that's left on other people and on ourselves. But there is something about well, particularly the deep time story. I mean, I found, which comes out in the chapter, the last bit, the voices of the universe. It's pretty powerful when you start connecting the fact that actually what science is now revealing is what was intuited and known by early peoples. The whole idea that something can come from nothing, and certainly I don't know so much about other creation stories, but certainly in the Māori creation story from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the that empty ground, te kore, that's full of potential. And I think whether that's just on a moment-to-moment basis, can we find that empty, still place in ourselves from which creativity and possibility comes? So there's that. But there's also the chance that we all have that long time history. All of us at one point or another were connected to the earth, we're born of the earth. And in the evolution story, we're all made of the same stuff. And something happened in that supernova explosion where the iron in our blood and the potassium in our brain and the calcium in our bones was formed. So whether it's on a physical level or an energetic level, we have this long history which is common to us all. And so then there's kind of permission to feel our Indigenous roots. I mean, I use that with a small I out of respect for other, Indigenous peoples. But yeah, so I think marrying the mythic with the scientific is great. And we have a friend who's influenced us a lot, Professor Jonathan Halliwell. He actually was a student of Stephen Hawking, was his PhD supervisor. And Jonathan, he kind of gave us permission to work with science, because I'm not a scientist, and I felt like, my husband, my husband and I have done a lot of this work together. In fact, Rod's probably done more of it with children, bringing the deep time scientific story to them, but doing it in a storied way. And Jonathan really encouraged us to go forward with that, because he said science is very good at stringing together a series of events of what happened, but it's totally stripped of meaning. And it's kind of weird if you think about it, that we're living in a time when arguably we know more about the universe than ever, but we're more separated from it. We don't feel our home within the cosmos. And even using the word like cosmos, people can think, oh, that's kind of flaky and new agey, rather than actually, we all have a home in a constantly evolving, changing, interconnected universe. So back to the overall theme of the book, how do we find strength and resilience in a story that, and a future that's uncertain and constantly changing? But there is this thing that we've got this very big home, and we have found our way forward through, if you just think of, when I say we, life has found its way forward through massive disruptions and twists and turns and change, and then new innovation and possibilities have come through.
Speaking about possibility in another sense, I would also like to ask, what are your hopes for the future? In particular, what do you hope that this book will achieve? And also, we also have the COP26 conference coming up this November, which seems like a place that would be full of possibility. So what are your hopes around those things?
My hopes, I think, I really hope there'll be permission for other ways of working, because it seems like governments are now setting quite high targets. I mean, I was thinking about New Zealand. It's got, high targets of where we want to be by 2050 or even shorter. But, this is a country that everyone thinks was really clean and green. But, it's hard to let in the fact that I think it's in 2019, it reported per capita, I think I'm right in saying, the second highest level of increased emissions next to Turkey. So, and then now we've, it's fairly recently, we've had Jacinda Ardern and this government that's put all these reports together about this climate change and the state of our water and so forth. And there is a reality that we have to shift from the complacency that we're in. But how do we do that? And I think there has to be a kind of shared recognition that on one level, none of us know. And on another level, maybe we really have to empower citizen-led approaches. And so I just moving back to thinking about London and the borough I live in. Similarly, Camden have really ambitious climate change targets, but to actually any innovation that's coming from the citizenry, it gets blocked and stifled, and because there's so many bureaucratic processes. And I think we're in a real, this might be a bit of a generalistic statement, but I think the institutions are in crisis. They're, the time of the institutional-led innovation is not going to get us there fast enough. And somehow the institutions need to become more porous and enable citizen-led initiatives to have a chance to try to innovate, and there to be bottom-up learning as well as top-down learning. And there needs to be a kind of greater level of respect about where possibilities are going to come from. So I hope that comes out, trust and ability to take risk. Because someone said to me recently, this guy used to be the head of economics in Treasury in New Zealand, and he said, the good and the bad news right now is that nobody really knows. And can we really let that in and have the heart and the resilience to let go of control and stop needing to be the expert and listen. Yeah, maybe that's what I hope will come out of it, the ability to listen.
That also seems to tie in with my last short question, which is if people could take just one message from the chapter, what would you like that message to be?
That's a great question. I'll just go with the first thing that came to mind. It's about the joy of standing in the middle of the river, of being in the middle of the river and swimming, and not having to be on I'm a this or I'm a that on either bank. And I mean, I think it's true for this time of COVID that seems so polarized in people's different approaches. And why do, you know, how I heard this expression in New Zealand actually of how they're, you know, it was in the biodiversity report of approaching, you know, how do we move forward? And there was this image of a braided river of people with different worldviews. And could we actually make room for a braided river of people with different worldviews working together, and not everyone has to be like us, but actually can we support each person to find out what's right for them? And then is it possible for different worldviews to work together? And within that, can all of us stop being so rigid about what's right and kind of stand in a more unknown place? So standing in the middle of a river, which is part of a braided river. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
What a great message to end with. Thank you so much, Jane, for being here with us. It was true joy talking to you for this little bit. And for those watching, if this conversation sparked your interest, Jane's chapter will be in the Climate Adaptation book coming out on the 25th of October, and you can find the link in the description. You can even pre-order it if you are interested. And you can also find in the description links to Jane's work where you can learn more about global generation. Thank you so much, Jane, and everyone watching us.
Thank you, Carolina. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.